Hello everybody, this is Ryan. Welcome to lesson 32 of learning HTML and CSS. In this lesson we'll be learning about floating elements using CSS. So I have a main heading, several paragraphs, and in the first two paragraphs I've got an image which is 100 pixels wide. Okay, so what I'd like to do is I'd like the text to wrap around the image, and I'd like the image to be on the left of the paragraph. So one could use vertical align as we did in a previous example, but to truly have the text wrap around the image you would need to use float from a CSS point of view. So in the CSS reference we go to the section on basic box and you'd see the float style sheet, and the values of float can either be none, which is the default, it's part of the normal document flow, or left, the element floats to the left of its parent container, or right, the element floats to the right of the parent container. Okay, so I'm going to create a class called float left on this image, applying it to the image, and we'll say dot float left and tell it to float left. Let's see what that does. So float actually takes the image out of its normal document flow and tries to make it go as far left as it can within its parent element. Alright, so what is the parent element of the image? In this case it's the paragraph. So within this paragraph the image will go as far left as it possibly can. Okay, now we'll do the same thing with the second image, except this one we're going to make float to the right. This you can call whatever you want. Remember, it's just a class, but in the actual CSS that must match up with that name, and this time around we'll tell it to float to the right. So here we have an image floating to the left of the paragraph, here we have an image floating to the right. This is a little too close for comfort here. The text is pretty much touching this image. So to solve this problem we will add a right margin to the image. So a margin dash right, let's say 5 pixels. Watch the gap increase. There we go. Much more pleasing to the eye. Obviously we can change fonts and things like that as well. This one I don't need to have a margin because it seems like the text naturally doesn't touch the image. Although if I were to resize the browser, that could change. But notice how nice it is with the text wrapping around the image. That's using float. Okay, so now the next thing I'd like to do is create some columns and put them next to each other. And we do that with divs, divisions, which we learnt about in a previous lesson. So I am going to take the middle two paragraphs and add them to a division with an ID of col1. Remember to indent so that you can see which container these paragraphs belong to, and to end the div tag when you come to the end of that container. Remember, div on its own has no effect until you add some CSS to it. So we'll create an ID for col1, maybe give it a background color and also a width, because by default a div is a block container, so it will take up the full width of the page. So we'll need to give it a width, let's say 400 pixels. Let's see now what that looks like. Okay, so now I've actually got a column, and it could do with a little bit of padding, I think. So we'll say padding. And I just want to apply it to the left and the right, not to the top and the bottom. Okay, that looks much better. And obviously you would justify the text and change the font and so on and so forth. Okay, so now let's put the next two paragraphs also into a column. So we'll add a div tag again, but this time we'll give it an ID of col2. Don't forget to close the div tag at the end and to indent so that you can see that these two paragraphs belong to that column. Remember, by itself the div tag has no effect until you add some CSS to that. Col2 background, let's make it orange, and this time I'll make it 400, 300, just for fun, and keep the same padding. And there we have column number 2. The only problem is they're not acting as columns. If they were columns, they would be side by side and not directly underneath each other. So the nature of a block element is that it acts as a block, so it's one underneath each other. So what we'll do is we'll need to float these to the left. So if I tell column 1 to float to the left, it will float as far left as it can within its parent container. And the parent container of this div would be the body. So it will go as far left as it can to within the body. So col2 needs to be next to that, so you would be tempted to tell it to float to the right, which you could do, but then you're going to have a wasted space in the middle. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so you see you've got this floating to the left, you've got this floating to the right of the body, and then of course all this other text from underneath that is actually now filling up the gaps. So what you would need to do is tell this not to float to the right, but to actually float to the left. Remember, that won't go, it will go as far left as it possibly can within its parent container, and because there's already a column floating to the left of the body, it can't go to the left of that, so it would have to be to the right of that, but it will still be as far left as it can within the body. So that lands up putting it right next to column number 1. And then if you want to, you could add a margin if you want some white space between this, although you don't have to. If you want to draw a vertical line between the two columns, what we could do is just have a border that's on the right hand side. And that will draw a border right down. If you wanted to go all the way to the end, you would need to then apply a left border to the second column, or otherwise make the heights the same of the two columns. So maybe we should do that. Let's add a height. I'm not sure how high we're going to have to make this. We'll have to play around a little bit. Looks like we need to go a little bit more. Let's try 500. Okay, that's too big, so I'll go to 450 maybe. Okay, that could work, but then I'll make this also 450. So if they're the same height, it will look neater. Okay, now they're exactly the same. So I could, of course, choose to make this a third column, but let's say I wanted actually to start on the next line. The problem is because these two are floating, this is just going to try and wrap around the floated elements. So if you don't want that behavior, what we'll have to do is put this into a div of its own. Or otherwise what we could do is just give this an ID of clear. Maybe a class will be better actually. because we may reuse it in the future. And then we learn about a new style sheet called clear. Now the clear style sheet is similar to float, except it almost cancels out the float. So what it will say is, if we say clear left, it means no elements can float to the left of this element. If we say clear right, it means no elements can float to the right of this element. And if we say clear both, it means no elements can float on either side of this element. So we would need to say clear left, because at the moment we have an element on the left of this. So we want to tell it that it must be clear to the left of this text. So now you can see that this text is being moved to the next line, because I told it there must be nothing floating to the left of this. So we probably want to just add a bit of a margin now above this, because it's too close to the columns. So then I'll just say, okay, margin dash top 10 pixels or 5 pixels or however much you want. That didn't work. So what I'll do maybe is add a bottom margin to this one. See if that works. Yeah. And there we have our lesson on floating elements.